As members of Congress push for an extension on the eviction moratorium, we're hearing about the impact the moratorium has had on some landlords from those landlords. Last week, one woman shared on Twitter that she was forced to sell her rental property after the government allowed their tenants to live rent-free for over a year. She explained that they received, quote, no break on paying property taxes, insurance, and utilities, unquote. The Twitter thread went viral, with people calling the landlord a, quote, leech, and celebrating that someone with two homes had lost one of them.
Author Ryan Girdusky said the whole event demonstrates, quote, an inability to understand the difference between money and institutional wealth. He joins us now to discuss. Ryan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So, yeah, explain the difference between wealth and money.
Right. Well, having money, having a nickel in your pocket is not the same as having institutional wealth. Someone worth $50 billion and someone with $5 million, which is a lot of money, are not on the same playing field. Somebody who has the institutional wealth of major corporations or emerging corporations that decide really how large sectors of the economy run are much different than an upper middle class or lower upper middle class, a lower upper class person in our country. And we should, as national populists, support one and be willing to tax the other one severely.
And I do think it's fair to say that that the situation that was described in that Twitter thread is not what you would call an ideal policy outcome. It's a policy failure. You wouldn't design that so that it would unfold that way, because who's going to end up buying that property anyway? You might wind up with exactly like some private equity giants swoop in.
Yes, equity giants will end up buying properties, and that's the thing, and that's why people who are classists are idiotic, because what they're doing is actually supporting institutional wealth by attacking people on the upper middle class or the lower upper class, people who have two homes. They're sitting there and saying, oh, fine, we can wait out the time that the eviction moratorium will end, which it has ended, and we'll just kick out those people who haven't paid any money, and then we'll own more property. That's why it's incredibly idiotic to celebrate somebody losing a second property because a corporation that owns thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of homes, is actually adding more property to their collection.
You've talked about the need to ban foreign private equity or foreign investors from owning tons of properties here in the United States. Would you extend that to domestic ones as well? Although when you talk about private equity, it's hard to even put like a national classification on it since capital is global.
Right. Well, there is foreign capital that has come into many major cities like Miami, like New York, like Los Angeles, that has risen the cost of housing. A city like New York, 50% of the housing is owned by the city to begin with. So the market is very, very small. And of that, foreign capital owns a significant amount, which raise costs and rents throughout the city. Miami is going to end up being the same way, probably, as many other major coastal cities are. That is a huge driving force. If you want to look at what's raising the cost of living in most major cities in the United States, the three things is there's a ton of city-owned properties which lay dormant. They don't actually do anything that could be used as housing. Secondly would be the mass immigration process. We brought 40 million people in 30 years, which raised the cost of living because they all live in the same basic metropolitan areas. And the third would be foreign investors buying huge swaths of property that they're using then for their own means, which they have a right to do if they own it, but they shouldn't be allowed to own that much property. Foreign investors own a ton of property in the United States.
Yeah, there is certainly a real issue with foreign investors coming in. I remember one time when I was living back in Sacramento, and this was in the early or mid 2000s, and there was actually some foreign investors who had come in and bought something like 2,000 single family homes. An outrageous amount, and they were able to pay cash, and they were able to outbid people. And this just makes it to where younger families are not able to live the American dream. And we're certainly experiencing that here in California right now. Friends of mine are trying to buy homes, and they're being outbid by foreign or just even domestic and wealthy investors, I should say, coming from domestic or foreign, they're able to outbid them by hundreds of thousands of dollars and paying cash on homes. I mean, do you think that there should be some other types of controls on that?
Yeah, you shouldn't be able. Foreign investors shouldn't be able to buy farmland in the Midwest right now. They're buying Chinese and Brazilian firms are buying tons of American farmland. Almost every major meat processor is owned by a foreign entity right now in the United States. We own very, very little of it, and this is where the government should work. I mean, I write this in the National Populist newsletter, which is my newsletter where I wrote the rebuttal to the woman's tweets, which is on Substack. What the government should be doing is sitting there and breaking up these institutions, these foreign-owned entities. Why don't we have these private public partnerships with like farm co-ops to do meat processing rather than having China and Brazil run all of our meat processing in this country? Why don't we sit there and try to force Russian, Chinese, and Saudi entities that buy up huge portions of property in major metropolitan areas to have to sell them back to the United States and try to sit there and rent it out to people who are able to purchase them? That is what drives up the cost of rent, that drives the cost of living for working class and middle class people. And that is why people are so quick to shoot out and attack anyone with a little bit of money. That is not the same thing as being institutional wealth. And people want to make money in this country. They don't necessarily like institutional wealth.
And speaking of institutional wealth, I think what a lot of people might not realize is that a lot of this foreign capital that floods into, say, Miami or New York to buy these expensive properties is actually just tax evasion and money laundering. Like people don't actually move into these properties; they just put them on their balance sheets and then put them, away from whoever their local tax authorities is, or whoever their local prosecutors are, who are wondering, who made off with the billions or the hundreds of millions of dollars in public money that was taken from whatever country that then flooded into New York, which is a different policy question than foreign capital owning meat processing plants or farmland in the United States, which is still an important question, and it still is a different question from private equity owning thousands of single-family homes. And I want to ask you about that one again, because maybe that is a kind of a difference between left-wing populism and right-wing populism. I'm not sure. I want to get your take on it. To me, I don't care where the private equity firm is based. I don't think that they should be able to own thousands or even dozens of residential homes. I think that those homes should be reserved for people in the United States to live in and to build wealth in. But where do you come down on that? Would you agree that private equity ought to be kept out of the kind of residential home market entirely, or as long as they're U.S. based, that's okay?
Well, I don't think that anyone should be limited by how many homes they are allowed to own. If Bill Gates wants to own 700 homes, I don't think there should be a limit on how many homes he wants to buy as an American citizen. He has the right to do whatever he wants. As far as private equity goes, I think there certainly should absolutely be more government overview on what they're doing with private equity and how they're buying homes, if they're buying them. If there should be limitations if they're buying them below market value when people are being foreclosed upon. I find it very hard. I would find it very hard to find a way for them to be limited in being able to be in the housing market completely. I just don't know how.
It'd be pretty easy. You would just say you have to, if you don't live in your home, then you have to pay.
And then Bernie Sanders would just sell two homes.
Well, or no, he'd just have to pay a higher tax rate.
Higher taxes. That's what they do in Europe.
Right. And right now you actually advantage private equity because all of the SALT taxes paid right now by private equity are all deductible. Those are expenses. So if you're private equity, you can write that off your taxes. If you're somebody competing with them who lives in the home, you're now capped after Trump's tax cut. And so you've created an unfair playing field with private equity.
Wait, what about Trump? Trump got rid of the SALT deduction?
Right, exactly. And so now homeowners are paying that. But if you're private equity, that's a business expense. So you can write it off. So you now have an advantage over people who are actually going to live in those homes.
reductions are a very minimal thing, and it's concentrated in very small states. I mean, that is not the crux of the larger argument. The larger argument is, do you want to sit there and make housing more affordable for working class, middle class people? If the answer is yes, private equity is not the thing gobbling up most homes in this country to raise the prices. Neither is somebody owning a second home. The problem is that there's far more people than the growth of housing, especially in concentrated areas because of mass immigration. And in those areas that there's the desire to live because they don't want to live in most places of the country. You have either an immense amount of government housing, which I'm not opposed, intensely to government housing, but there's an immense amount of government housing and of the housing available for an equity, which is at least more, you could honestly make an argument against foreign money people coming in to buy a property than domestic ones. I mean, should there be more regulations on it? Should they have to pay a higher tax rate? I'm absolutely for banning a higher tax rate. How do you ban an institution from owning property? That's a couple of hairs to sit there and twist, because then they could probably sit there.
I think this becomes an interesting question, because on the right, the question of national populism has always been whether it's more about the nationalism or more about the populism. And I think if you're not willing to take on the private equity industry on this particular question, it seems like it's more about the nationalism than the populism.
No, I'm not willing to take on private equity, but I'm million things. I literally write in the piece in my Substack, tax the shit out of them, like in big black bold letters. I do believe in taxing these institutions more. I'm 100% on board with that. At the same exact time, how do you ban them inherently from taking action in the marketplace? That's a question I'm not exactly going to sit there and jump head first in. Is there more regulations or more taxes for these private equity firms worth billions of dollars? I'm all for that. To sit there and say you can't actually tap into the market, I'm not an expert on that. I would like to look more research before I sit there and say, no, they're flat out ban it.
Yeah, I think you make some really good points. I think that it would be a lot easier to ban foreign investment at this point, the same way that China bans it. I mean, plenty of countries do. I think even Mexico, you can't really buy a house there if you're not a Mexican citizen. I think you could kind of, borrow it for like 99 years or something like that. Yeah. So I think it would be certainly easier to do that than it would be to ban domestic, American citizens from going around and buying things. So I can certainly understand that point. And I understand the point of raising the taxes as well, maybe to disincentivize them from owning so much property. That's possibly a way to go about that. So I understand that argument quite a bit, but certainly I think we all agree that there is absolutely a problem, right? That we have not enough single family homes for Americans who are trying to live the American dream.
There's a problem with our culture that sits there where a woman sits there, talks about losing the home that she inherited from her father-in-law and celebrates that as if it's a win against plutocrats and money makers and the wealthiest of the wealthy, when it's a woman owning a second home who makes $40,000 a year. And $40,000 a year of extra supplemental income is a lot of money. It's not wealth. And there's a difference between money and wealth. And if you don't know,
the conversation has with that. I think people have kind of lost sight of the real people that we're trying to go after, right? It's not the little guy who is finally starting to build that wealth that can be generational wealth for their family. It's, the bigger ones that are gobbling, the monoliths that are coming around and gobbling stuff up. So it's a bit different on that.
Ryan, thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. You and I can sit down and write the legislation on the private equity front, keep our eyes on that prize. Thanks for joining us.
Great.
Thank you, Ryan. All right, next on Rising, Richard Hanania joins us to discuss how the government is handling COVID.